Chapter 12. Down in Mizraim. That night, they slept uneasily. Going to bed hungry was never a wholesome or enviable prospect. Early in the morning, the servants went up and about their business of taking down the tents and gathering up the flocks and herds and making ready for the long journey southward. By morning's light, everyone was up and ready for the long journey southward. Abram was at the head of the company. Behind him, Eleazar holding the reins of Sarai's camel, and one for Abram to ride. It would be a long journey, and Abram was not getting any younger. Eleazar had convinced him that it would be folly to walk all the way there, and so he would ride. "I have a bad feeling about this journey," Abram said aloud. "My lord," Eleazar stated, "sometimes a prince must do what is best for his people, against the inclinations of his heart. That is duty, and it is an honorable thing." Abram turned to Eleazar and gave him a friendly pat on the shoulder. "You speak truth, Eleazar. I must consider the needs of others, not only myself." Eleazar knelt and allowed Abram to step on his back in order to mount the camel. Abram then urged the camel up onto its feet and gave the command, "Move out!" And the caravan once again hit the road. Only this time they were not in search of water or fresh grazing land, but of a new country to sojourn in for the time being. The man of Damascus made his way through the company, repeating his master's commands. Slowly but surely they began to move. Large herds of sheep, goats, cattle, and the multitude of camels, donkeys, and servants on foot kicked up a massive cloud of dust in the direction of what had once been their old campground. All eyes were now facing southward, towards the hope of their surviving the famine. But as the dust settled behind them, a lone figure, dressed all in black, stood in the rocky remains of what had once been their camp. From beneath the black hood, a familiar feminine voice spoke, half to itself, in unsurprised amusement.
"He has forgotten him."
The journey south led them through the rocky hill country. It was dangerous, to say the least, but there were no roads in this region. So they wound their way through the canyons and valleys, seeking paths as best they could that would lead them southward. By and by, they came within sight of the small town of Jebus in the midst of the hill country. It would be many years before that little town became a sprawling city upon 7 hills, and that time was not to be in the lifetime of the son of Terah. For now, they passed the Jebusite town by and continued their way south towards Beersheba. It was a day and a half's journey more before they arrived at Beersheba. They lingered here only long enough to purchase what food they could for themselves and their flocks. The merchants extorted higher prices from them than usual on account of the famine, but Abram was willing to be generous with his money if it meant acquiring what he and the caravan needed with haste. When evening came, they pitched their tents outside the walls of Beersheba and enjoyed what would be the last step of civilization before they passed into the great desert. From the merchants they spoke to in Beersheba, they learned that untold leagues of seemingly impassable desert lay between them and the land of Mizraim. Early that morning, the servants took down their tents, and they continued their way southwestward. Though they were leaving the famine-ravaged land behind them, the words of the merchants gave them a foreboding sense that they would be missing Canaan ere long. By midday, they had passed out of the dry, arid lands southwest of Beersheba, and continued onward through the rocky land. As a rule, they ate only a little of their food rations, for they had to make them last until they came to Mizraim, a journey which would take them 14 days. The land became harsher and more barren with every mile west they went. Empty fields of nothing but massive sand dunes filled the horizon for miles in every direction, broken only by distant granite sentinels in the southern sky, rising like towers of living death to bar the way to the southern sea. The oppressive heat of the day parched and burned them sore, and the wind was hot and bitter. Here they encountered many more sandstorms than they had in the crossing from Padan to Shechem. Several of the servants even died because of the sandstorms, choking to death, and some of them were stricken with blindness. There seemed to be no end to the hardships of the desert. On the few clear nights, where they had no sandstorms to fear, Abram would look up at the stars and chart their path by their light. For the better part of the journey, they were on good course westward. Only a few times, on account of the daily hazards of the rugged, blistering, and unforgiving landscape, had they veered off course either to the right hand or to the left. But even this wasn't all that easy for the star-gazing Abram. The moon shone on many a night, with a brilliance so great that its light was captured in the white sand of the desert floor. It was for this reason that people in later times would call this land the wilderness of the moon. Through these wide valleys of sand and rock they continued their endless journey, mile after mile, day after day. It seemed that they were going nowhere. For those who walked, their feet sank into the sand with each step, making walking an arduous chore they had wasted more and more energy on with each passing day. Yet they had now traversed farther than many in those days had ever traveled, and Abram's journey had been the farthest of any of them. And though they could not see it, they were coming closer and closer to the land of Mizraim with each passing day. At last, one day, they finally saw before them, on the edge of the western horizon, something stronger than a desert mirage. A line of green that flickered in the heat of the day, but did not vanish. They made haste towards that line, moving with renewed haste. By and by they came closer, urging their camels into a healthy trot, eager to come to the green pastures before them. Slowly but surely they began to see the distant shapes of palm trees rising out of the horizon. They knew the sight of palm trees, for they had gathered dates from them for their meals and often rested to eat in their shade while traversing the wilds of Canaan for pasture land. The palms grew larger, and the ground under their feet became tough, wiry grass. Then it grew thicker and verdant, till they found themselves on the edge of a green, fecund land bordering a sapphire ribbon of water. The caravan practically flocked to the river's edge, with the flocks bleating and lowing with loud voices as their nostrils smelled the fresh, growing grass. Like a flood, they threw themselves into the green land. The shepherds, goats, donkeys, cattle, and camels devoured the grass with ravenous hunger, and the servants, amazed and jubilant after the long journey through the desert, fell to their knees on the banks of the river and dove their faces into its waters. The water was brackish to the taste, and they could not drink it, but they were not too disturbed at this. There must surely be fresh water around here, what with all the greenery around the banks of this river. They went about without orders, looking for wells from which to quench their thirst. But the nobles didn't stop them. Indeed, they were more than happy to be here after the long and dangerous journey. They themselves were willing and eager to leap off their camels and wade into the crystal-clear waters of the river. Eleazar and Oni, despite their eagerness, helped Abram, Sarai, Lot, Addo, and the children of Lot off their camels. At once they approached the river's edge and waded into the cool depths of the shallows. Lot laughed aloud and cupped draughts of water in his hands up to his face and washed the heat and dust of the desert off his face. His wife Addo did likewise, while the children splashed and played as children were wont. Abram and Sarai merely waded calmly in the shallows and let the water wash away the sand that had gathered in their sandals. After so long in the desert, it felt good to wade in the waters of the river. They felt as though they were in paradise. For the moment, Abram stooped down to look at his reflection in the waves. His hair was more gray than black, and his beard had grown very long. Across his face, slight lines of care were starting to appear more and more noticeable. These he hadn't seen, for he was not given to vanity and had few opportunities to look at his reflection when shepherding in Canaan. Nearby, he heard the gentle splashing of the waters, and looking thither, was suddenly stunned into silence. Sarai was there, wading in the water, but her headscarf was removed. Her long, raven locks were now flowing freely in the hot desert air. It was the first time since they had been married that Abram saw her full face in the light of day. Usually, she wore her hair up, or bound in a scarf back in Ur and Padan, and had rarely taken it off since they came to Canaan. When they did make love, which was becoming less and less frequent as the years went by, they were in complete darkness in the tent. In the morning, he would rise early to pray and offer sacrifices to God, and wouldn't see her until she was decent and covered in her scarf. And now that he saw her in the clear light of day, it was a marvel. He felt once again like the starry-eyed man of 50, come off from the wilderness of Urartu, seeing her beneath the canopy in the house of his father. Aside from a few strands of silver, like threads of starlight in the midnight firmament of her head, she seemed to have not aged at all. Her cheeks were still smooth and spotless, her lips full and supple, and her eyes glistening from the light shimmering off the surface of the water. While her beauty enamored Abram, his servant Eleazar was looking after the servants. A cry of joy leaped up from them as they found a well of fresh water and began eagerly drawing water and drinking straight from the very bucket. But as he lifted his head up, he could hear voices crying out in a foreign language and a distant line of dust on the horizon. He made his way over to Abram's side. "Master!" he called out. "Master! The Mizraim are coming." He pointed out to the line of dust. "Are we in any danger here?" Abram asked. "Perhaps, my lord," Eleazar said. "We're famished and weary, and they're well rested and fat. We couldn't resist their tithing even if we wanted to." "Tithing?" Abram asked. "It is said the people of Mizraim have strange laws," Eleazar stated. "One of their heroes, the Amorite Reachion, began a law of taking the tithe of money from those who die in Mizraim. For this, he was named first after the king. They may force us to pay the tithe of all we have for sojourning in their land." Abram's mouth hung open, aghast for a moment. He then told Eleazar to bring the others out of the water and assemble at the caravan. He then waded through the water to where Sarai stood. As he stared at her, his thoughts seemed to be lost for one moment, enraptured as he was by her beauty. But then the sound of distant approach roused him back to himself. "Sarai," he said, "if I may have a moment with you." She looked up at him, her face strewn with strands of her dark and gray hair. With a gentle motion of her hand, she swept the hairs out of her face and smiled at Abram. He smiled back, but with a ruthful air to his grin. "My lord?" she asked. "What's wrong?" "I'm troubled," he said. "We are in a strange land, one that does not fear the eternal God. I've heard troubling rumors about what the people here will do to us, to me." "I don't understand what you're saying," she replied. "Only that the Eternal has gifted you with great beauty," Abram stated. Sarai blushed, averting her eyes in a graceful, demurred way. "Don't be foolish, my lord. I am an old woman, you know that." "But you are indeed beautiful," Abram replied. "And for that, I fear for our safety." "What do you mean?" "These Mizraim don't fear the eternal God," Abram began. "As everyone else in this world, they've forgotten the 7 laws of Noah. They will exact a tithe from us for coming to their land, and when they see you, I fear that they will slay me and take you from me." Sarai gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "I fear so," Abram nodded, "and I doubt they'll care much if we are married." "What should we do?" Sarai whispered. "Listen to what I say, and do what I tell you," he said. "If they ask, tell them that you are my sister. It's not entirely untrue, for you are the daughter of Haran, my brother, and we are kindred indeed. Please, my heart, whatever they ask you, tell them that you are my sister." "But what about the others?" Sarai asked. "I'll speak to them," Abram assured her. "Don't worry. It will all be well with us." Abram went to the others and told Lot and Addo about his deception. In addition, he told Eleazar that as long as they were in Mizraim, they were to refer to the lady Sarai as Abram's sister and remain silent on the matter of their marriage. The plan seemed perfect in every regard, and his servants wouldn't fail to carry it out. Yet for some reason, Abram could not shake this nagging feeling that something was wrong. His thoughts and fears came to cloud his mind and send shivers of worry up and down his spine. What would stop the Mizraim from taking Sarai, even if he told them that she was his sister? They might not kill him, but they would still take her from him. It suddenly dawned upon him that he had made a grave mistake. But how could he rectify it? Even now, the dust of the Mizraim was growing closer. Their banners could be seen flying high in the midday sky. It would take too long now to rescind his word from all his servants. Yet the fear of what would happen once the Mizraim arrived still gripped his soul. "My lord?" Eleazar asked. He had marked Abram's pacing this way and that in front of the camels, and guessed that something was wrong. "This isn't going to work," Abram said. "We told them all what to say, master," Eleazar replied. "What could go wrong?" "They may take her just the same," Abram returned. "What can we do then, my lord?" Abram looked across the caravans, hoping that something would suddenly appear out from among the camels and give him an idea. He noticed a very large chest on one of the packed camels, situated between two of its humps. The chest, he recalled, was used to store the luxury goods that they had acquired in Ur, and had been with them all this time. He pointed Eleazar to the chest. "Quickly," he said, "take what you can hide out and put Sarai inside the chest." "My lord, are you sure that's a wise decision?" Eleazar asked. "Do not question me, Eleazar," Abram replied. "I've never had need to punish you. Don't start now. Our lives are at risk." "But the lady, it's improper." "Do as I say!" Abram shouted. Eleazar bowed, his eyes wide with shock, uttering a soft, "Yes, master," and then called for the other servants to assist him in removing the chest from the camel's back and clearing out room in it for the lady Sarai. While this was happening, Abram went back to the head of the caravan and brought Sarai back. She was none too happy about being put into a box. "I am a daughter of Terah, a prince of Padan and Ur," she retorted. "I will not be put in a chest like some meager possession." "It is for your own good, my lady," Abram assured her. Yet despite his assurances, she was not convinced. In the end, Abram had to have two servants pick her up, kicking and protesting, and place her in the chest. Abram told her not to speak as the lid was placed over the chest, and it was moved as close to the caravan and out of sight as possible. And just in time as well. Before them there appeared a company of men, who were now fast approaching the caravan. In appearance they were like them, only that they had no beards, and many of them were completely shaven bald, while others wore wigs of black hair that came down to the shoulders. Like the people of Ur, most of them wore only a skirt about the loins, save for one important fellow in the midst of them. He wore a blue khat, or cap crown, about his bald head, kohl upon his eyes, and had in his hand a staff like a shepherd's crook. All the men were armed in one way or another. Most of them with shields, spears, bows, and arrows, and a few with bronze maces, while the important one had a dagger of bronze in his belt. The important-looking man held up his hand, and the company of footmen came to a halt. Behind him stood a bald man with a scroll made of dried reeds, with an inkhorn strapped across his chest, and a reed in his other hand. Obviously a scribe, though his writing medium was reed and not a clay tablet, and therefore strange to the people from Canaan. With the scribe in tow, the important man approached the caravan and, to their surprise, began to speak to them in Akkadian. "Welcome to the Black Land," he said to them. "From your dress and your smell, I take it you are Habiru, are you not?" "You speak our language?" Eleazar asked. "It is our law," the important man stated, "that our prince must know all 70 languages of the world." "Are you the prince of this land?" Abram asked. "I am no mark of the white walls," the man said. "But our prince is Pharaoh, son of Ra, the Lord of Souls. He does not appear among the people but once every year, and he has already appeared this year. The nomarchs govern this land in his stead, and I myself am distinguished as an educated man, knowing 200 of the 70 languages. Setu-Neshret is my name. I am Abram, son of Terah, Abram greeted. These are my people. We have come from Canaan seeking... Setu-Neshret held up his hand. I know why you have come, Habiru, he replied. It is because of the famine in the south. You will find little welcome here, on account of your low status. We are not fond of shepherds in the Black Land. South? Abram asked. We came from the north. Setu-Neshret grinned. In the Black Land, north lies that way. He gestured southwards, towards the springs of the great river Nile, and south lies towards the delta. But I wouldn't expect Habiru shepherds to understand the ways of civilized people. Why do you call us Habiru? Abram asked. You are from Pa Canaan, are you not? Setu-Neshret asked, gesturing to the people of the caravan. That is the land of Habir, and therefore you are Habiru. Abram's eyes widened suddenly. If he was deciphering this man's words correctly, they knew at least of Heber, or of the people of Heber, and named the land of the Amorites after him. I see that you are not heavily armed, Setu-Neshret stated. He stroked his chin with a hand heavily laden with golden rings. Perhaps we may let you sojourn in the Black Land. But first, we shall behold your caravan so that a precise tithe may be mete out from you. The official began to walk alongside the caravan, accompanied by his guards and the scribe. Here and now he would cast his eyes upon the camels and what they had, and, whispering in his own tongue, give instructions to the scribe to write these down. Abram followed behind him, and Eleazar followed on behind him. He walked fearfully, as though his life was being assessed for a sale to which he was not privy to, nor entitled to any compensation of gold or silver for the loss thereof. At last, the moment came when Abram's heart sank into the bottom of his feet. The nomarch stopped, and pointed with his staff at the chest. What's in this box? He asked of Abram. Nothing of any importance, my lord, Abram stammered, rushing over to stand between Setu-Neshret and the chest. That is for me to judge, Habiru, the official replied with a taciturn tone. Open it. Nay, my lord, Abram continued. Only name anything that I have, and I will pay a tithe upon it. What could be so precious that you will not reasonably open it to us? Setu-Neshret asked. He then leaned in, speaking almost in a whisper to Abram. Does it contain the white? The what? You know, the white, Setu-Neshret replied, rubbing his thumb and forefingers together. Lustrous metal, whose worth is far above that of gold in these parts. Oh, silver, Abram reasoned. No, it is not silver, but I will give you a tithe of all silver that I have. Only do not open this chest. Not the white, Setu-Neshret exclaimed in awe, taking a step back. But willing to part with the white on account of it? It must be precious indeed. Are there precious stones in your chest? Wheat? Barley? Spices? Whatever it may be, open the chest and give us a tithe thereon. I grow tired of haggling with you. All that you ask, my lord, Abram stammered, holding out his arms between the official and the chest. I will surely give to you. Only do not open this chest. Enough! Setu-Neshret cried out in frustration. With a snap of his fingers, the guards gathered around him. 2 men on either side of Abram seized him by the arms and moved him away from the chest. Eleazar, seeing his master in danger, would have thrown himself at the Mizraim, if not one of the guards pressed the point of his spear against his chest. The other soldiers pointed their spears at the other servants, who had drawn their staves in preparation to defend the caravan. Lot reached for his knife. As the son of a nobleman and priest, he was afforded the luxury of a bronze dagger, but didn't draw it upon seeing the armed men. Setu-Neshret took from one of the soldiers a mace, and with it smashed the lock off the chest. He then tipped open the lid and sprung back, letting the mace fall from his hand and onto the ground beside him. "Sons of the Pharaohs!" he exclaimed. His eyes were enraptured by the sight of Sarai, lying in the bottom of the chest. Her veil had fallen off, and they saw her face as few others ever did. The soldiers themselves also looked at her in marvelous wonder. Even the scribe periodically stole glances at her from the corners of his roll. "Truly a marvel beyond all imagining. Tell me, Haberu, who is this fair maiden that she be hidden in such demeaning fashion?" "This is Sarai," Abram answered. "My sister. We keep her in the chest when traveling through the desert to spare her complexion." One of the soldiers said something in the language of Mizraim, and Setaneshret scolded him. He then turned back to Abram. "Your caravan shall remain here until I have brought your sister before Pharaoh," he said. "He shall decide what to do with you." He then turned to Sarai and ordered her, in as pleasant a voice as he could muster, to rise and follow them. She turned to Abram, who nodded ruefully. Slowly she lifted herself up out of the chest and stepped over to Setaneshret's side. At a command from him, in their tongue, the soldiers closed in about them and began to depart. Sarai cast a fearful glance back at Abram, her brown eyes full of pleading and fear. Abram could do nothing but stare on after her and weep as she had been taken away. Despite his best efforts to prevent this, he had brought about precisely what he had feared the most. "What have I done?" It took the rest of the day for Setaneshret to deliver Sarai to the capital city of the Black Land. She spoke little to any of them save for Setaneshret, who alone of them could speak Akkadian, which she knew as well as Abram. For oftentimes she would have to go to the marketplace in Shechem on behalf of him, or for something she herself and the women of the camp needed. From him she learned that she was to be going before the ruler of the land, known as Pharaoh. The capital city to which she was being taken was called in their tongue the Life of the Two Lands. She learned that the two lands meant the two portions of the Black Land. The uplands were farther south, and were so named because the great river flowed down from that land. The lowlands were here in the north, where the great river fanned out like the blossom of a water lily into a great fecund delta. By and by, as the day wore on towards the evening, they came within sight of the white walls of the city of Ankh Tawy, the life of the two lands. They made as straight a route as they could towards the palace, to not draw the attention of curiosity seekers. Yet even so, some stole glances at the fair Habiru women, and a small crowd followed the procession. It made Sarai nervous to have the eyes of what felt in her mind to be the whole city upon her. She barely had any time to take in the beauty of that city, which was at least comparable to the magnificence of her native Ur. To the great palace with its golden doors they arrived. Setaneshret ordered the gatekeepers to open the gates before them, and they passed inside. Once they had entered, they stood in the antechamber of the Pharaoh's court. Here they paused from their great walk, and Setaneshret gave Sarai a brief instruction in the etiquette of the court. "You have come into the palace of the Pharaoh," he told her. "This is a great honor for you. He will see you and judge the case of your brother and his people. While you are in the throne room, you will conduct yourself with the strictest decorum. Tell me, fairest of all maidens, how many languages do you speak?" Sarai seemed bewildered by this response, but she was accustomed to court etiquette and hid her surprise behind a stoic face. "Your handmaiden speaks the tongue of Canaan, as well as her mother tongue." "Very well," Setaneshret nodded. "You are to advance no further than 2 steps towards the Pharaoh's throne, unless he summons you up nearer to him. Do not make eye contact with him. If he stands, you must bow. Speak no lies in his presence, for Ra knows all truths and reveals them to his son the Pharaoh. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Sarai replied. At this, Setaneshret turned and commanded that the doors to the palace be opened. Inside was a sight that took Sarai's breath away. The throne room was made of white marble, with large pillars of blue marble that looked almost black. On the far side of the room was a great staircase of alabaster with no fewer than 70 steps. At the top step was a dais erected, upon which a golden throne was built, flanked by golden statues of falcons on either side, and the likeness of falcons carved into the walls behind it, with their wings spread out on either side of the throne, above and below. Upon the throne was a middle-aged man, bald of head and dressed in a white skirt that came down to just above the knees. Upon his head was a double crown, the lower of which was crimson, and the loftier of which was white, and upon his chin was a false goatee. Slowly Setaneshret approached the throne, with Sarai and the guards in tow. The scribe he dismissed in the antechamber until he was to be called upon. At the bottom of the steps, Setaneshret greeted the pharaoh and spoke to him in their own language, which Sarai did not understand. As per his instructions, Sarai followed Setaneshret up as far as 2 steps, counting them mentally as she made the ascent, and stopped. He, on the other hand, continued to ascend another 28 steps, and continued to speak to the pharaoh. In between, keeping her head down, Sarai periodically peeked up to see what was happening before her. The pharaoh had risen from his throne, and was now standing 5 steps away from Setaneshret, who was no doubt delivering a heavily biased account of the meeting with Abram and the caravan, she feared. After many long minutes of this, where Sarai felt distinctly alone and outside among people whose language she knew not, Setaneshret spoke with a loud voice in the Akkadian language. "May the fair lady ascend to the 1st and 30th step, and speak to the son of Ra." Picking up the skirts of her dress, Sarai began to make the ascent. In her mind, she counted out the steps: 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on and so forth. While Abram was at home among the flocks and herds in the wilderness, her place was in the palace halls. If she were here under better circumstances, she might have enjoyed it more than she did now. 19, 20, 21, 22, swiftly but gracefully she made her way up the stairs, counting them off in her mind and assuring that her lips moved not. 28, 29, 30, 31, she came to a halt, and looked up slightly in the direction of the pharaoh. She bowed her head low and kept her eyes averted. A hush fell upon the court as the pharaoh descended the last few steps, and placed his hand underneath Sarai's chin, to lift it up to meet his eyes. There was an amorous look in his eyes, but it didn't put Sarai at ease. She had spent many years in the court of Ur, and knew the fair faces of the princes and nobles who had other designs upon her. But now she was wholly in the power of a foreign king. Her father Haran was dead, Nahor was on the other end of the world, and the only other man who could have defended her had been the reason she was in this position to begin with. "Verily, the fairness of Isis pales in comparison to your loveliness, my lady," the pharaoh said in the Akkadian tongue. "There is no woman in the Black Land who is your equal for beauty." He then turned to Setaneshret and spoke words to him in their own tongue, leaving Sarai to marvel that he knew their language as well. After some words were spoken, he turned back to Sarai. "Do not be afraid," he said. "I mean you no harm, either you or to your people. Behold, your brother, this prince of the Habiru, has brought me a gift beyond value. Truly you must be a nobility, for no ordinary woman could possess such great beauty. You shall be my queen, and rule over the 2 lands with me in this life, and the field of reeds in the next." Sarai did not answer, but was indeed shocked at his forwardness. She feared to answer him with the truth, for she remembered that Abram was still under the pharaoh's power. Though she objected to being stowed away in a chest like some piece of jewelry, she had no objection to dissembling in order to spare his life, at least on the onset. Now that their little deception was starting to unravel, she feared for her safety and her honor. "I understand, fair lady," Pharaoh continued. "This is a strange land, and you are not familiar with our customs. Come, I shall give you my daughter, the child of my body, to be your handmaiden. She speaks your language, and will serve you in all things." Sarai was led out of the throne room, and into one of the many side rooms of the palace. In a little time, too soon for Sarai's liking, a fair damsel entered the room. She was very beautiful to look upon, olive-covered skin, similar to Sarai's, and her hair the color of ebony. She had a pleasant face, which placed Sarai at ease in her presence. For one moment, Sarai's heart ached within her bosom, for not only did this young woman remind her so much of herself when she was much younger, but she realized how much she yearned for children of her own. "My lady," the young woman said respectfully, "I am Hadjetre, daughter of Pharaoh. My lord has asked that I be your servant and instruct you in our ways." "Thank you, daughter," Sarai said to her. "You are most kind to me. As are you, my lady," Hadjetre replied, blushing. "No one has called me daughter since my mother died." "Who is your mother, child?" "A concubine in Pharaoh's harem," Hadjetre answered. "It is a great honor to serve you, my lady." "Why is that?" Sarai asked. "I am a stranger to you." "My lord Pharaoh holds you in high esteem, my lady," said Hadjetre. "When he spoke to me about you, he said that he had great blessings to bestow upon you, including granting you the nome of the plumed falcon as an inheritance. For so high a value he places on you, he told me that life as your servant was a better future for me than to live in the harem." Sarai nodded, but her resolve was starting to crack. Apparently, the young woman could sense this as well. "Is something wrong, my lady?" she asked. "I am concerned for my brother," Sarai replied. "Not to worry," Hadjetre replied. "The Pharaoh will be sure to treat him well for your sake. You are to be married to my lord father, and therefore your brother is to become brother to the Pharaoh. You need not fear for his sake." Sarai closed her eyes and smiled, but the pain inside her heart did not subside. The rest of that day was spent in a grueling purification process, at least for the woman of 65 years. Hadjetre led her to a room with a shallow pool of water, into which she bathed. Afterward, the young woman anointed Sarai's body with fragrant oil, which was rather uncomfortable for her, being touched so closely by anyone who was not her lord husband. Despite Hadjetre's insistence that it would be for her own benefit, Sarai insisted that her hair be not cut, and instead it was combed with an ivory comb. She had very little time to care to her own image in the desert, being the heart and soul of the camp, and as responsible for their livelihood as Abram was with the flocks. Once she was cleaned and purified, Sarai was dressed in a white linen gown, such that was customary to the garb of the women of Mizraim. The material was soft and sheer, which breathed in the hot environment of the Black Land, as Hadjetre put it. In addition to this, she was laden with many fine jewels that Sarai herself would have loved to have in her own possession. Bracelets and arm rings of gold and turquoise, rings for her fingers and her ears, and a necklace of gold, turquoise, lapis, and silver, commonly known in Mizraim as the white, upon her neck. Last of all, Hadjetre painted Sarai's eyes with kohl, then presented her with a mirror of polished gold in which to review her reflection. "You truly are lovely beyond words, my lady," Hadjetre said. "You will surely please Pharaoh tonight." "Tonight?" Sarai asked, a note of surprise in her voice. "Yes," the young woman replied, a little confused at Sarai's shock. "When he consummates your union. Now then, if there is nothing else for me to do for you, I will see that the cooks prepare food and wine for my lady." "That will be all, thank you," Sarai said. "You are dismissed." Hadjetre bowed and left the room. No sooner had she departed, but Sarai covered her face with her hands and wept softly. The fear and terror that she had experienced while going from the caravan to Ankh Tawy, held in reserve by her queen-like grace and decorum, now reached a boiling point. She could keep silent no longer, especially now that she was to be defiled by a man who was not her lord husband. There was no one here to defend her, as all the men were far away in the camp, and the hosts of Mizraim stood between them and her. Only a god could save her now. She gasped as a new thought entered her heart. The eternal God. They had quite forgotten about him when they undertook the voyage down to Mizraim. They had suffered the famine well, without murmur or complaint, but instead of praying and sacrificing to him for relief, they came to this land and made a mess of things. She had it in her heart to pray to him and beg him for help in this time of her great need. She came to a window in the room where she had been groomed and dressed and sought out one that looked eastward, towards Canaan. There, with coal-stained streams flowing down her cheeks, she opened her heart to the eternal God as best she could. "O merciful God," she prayed, "you told my lord Abram to leave Padan and journey to the land of Canaan, and that all would be well with us if we obeyed you. Behold, we have obeyed your command, only now we came here, to the land of Mizraim, only to avoid the famine and to save ourselves from starvation. Now this terrible misfortune has befallen us. Hear my prayer, eternal God, and save me from the hand of Pharaoh. I admit that we have erred and done wrong in this matter. Look upon us with the same free, unmerited favor that you showed to Noah, and do well to myself and to my lord Abram, and to our people, for the sake of thy mercy." That evening Sarai ate little, for the fear of what would happen was so great that she felt her stomach would turn and she would vomit. Instead, she let the young woman Hadjetre eat her portion. She was quite taken aback at this, and protested many times, but Sarai insisted. The young woman looked at her with awe and surprise the whole while she picked at the food on the golden plate. "I have lived my whole life as a servant, due to my mother's low status," she said to Sarai. "No one has ever given me food from Pharaoh's golden plates. It's not right." "No, to the contrary," Sarai returned with an assuring smile. "It is best this way. You have shown me much kindness this day. You have been to me as a friend when I was a stranger in a strange land. For that I am truly grateful." She looked down at Hadjetre, who was kneeling on the floor eating, while she sat upon the bed in the Pharaoh's bedchamber. "You speak my language, daughter. I should give you a name in our language, one that will be only for the two of us." "You honor me more than I deserve, my lady," Hadjetre replied. Suddenly the sound of the Pharaoh's voice in the tongue of Mizraim could be heard coming down the hall. Hadjetre took up the golden plate and left Sarai alone in the dimly lit room. Far too soon for Sarai's liking. Already she felt alone and separated from everyone. There had been no answer to her prayer yet, and dark thoughts began to enter her head. Perhaps the Eternal was not pleased with her response. Perhaps he only answered the prayers of men? Yet despite this, she chose once again to whisper pleas of the same under her breath. While the footsteps of the Pharaoh were still echoing down the hallway toward her, there suddenly appeared a figure in the room with her. A tall man, robed in the garb of the desert people, with a long beard upon his chin. Sarai gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. The stranger gave a quiet shush, pressing his finger to his bearded lips. "Shh." "Who are you?" she asked. "I am a servant of the Most High," said Gabriel. "Do not be afraid, Sarai, daughter of Haran. Your prayers have been answered. The prince of Mizraim will not touch you." Again he shushed her. "Shh," then retreated into the shadows of the room. At that very moment, the doors were opened, and there stood Pharaoh, dressed in his white linen skirt and jewelry. The crown was removed from off his head, and his bald head glistened in the soft candlelight of the room. "Behold the queen of the two lands," he greeted. "Never has there been so fair a sight in all of this land. A fair lotus blossom risen up from the depths of the red land. Come, let us be drunk with love until the morning." "My lord, I would rather sleep," Sarai said. "It has been a long journey, and I am weary." "Nonsense," the Pharaoh dismissed. "It is only natural for the lovers to consummate their union before the night is over." He had now approached the bed where she sat and reached down his hand to place upon her shoulder. But no sooner had his fingers touched the sheer silken cloth of her garment, but his hand shrank back from her as though it had been struck. Sarai exclaimed in excitement. She certainly hadn't done it, for she had not the strength to turn the Pharaoh from his lusts. "How dare you strike the son of Ra?" Pharaoh retorted, his fury rising in his bosom. "It wasn't me, my lord," Sarai replied, shaking her head fearfully. In his anger, he reached forth his hand to seize her by the hair and force her into submission. But no sooner had his hand touched the locks of her head, but that was struck back as well, and he lost his balance and fell onto the smooth floor of the bedchamber. By now he was furious, and intent on having his way with this woman whether she wished it or not. Rising from the floor, he charged at her, reaching out his hand to seize her by the neck and force her down onto the bed. But no sooner had his hands touched the soft flesh of Sarai's neck, but he cried out in pain and stepped back from her. Now it was his chance to cry and scream, for in the dim light of the room he could see red spots upon his hands where they had touched Sarai's neck, and small flakes of skin peeling away from his hands. "Unclean!" he gasped, wide-eyed in horror. "Unclean!" With that, the Pharaoh turned tail and left the bedchamber, crying out for his physicians. Sarai, on the other hand, was shivering in fear herself. She hadn't laid a hand on the Pharaoh, yet he had been tossed about and stricken as though he were no bigger than a small child. And when he cried out unclean, she was truly terrified. What if she was leprous and had passed it on to him? Frantically, she searched out one of the ebony chests in the side of the room for the gold mirror. Then, walking over to one of the golden lamps in the room, she examined herself in the faint light. The linen gowns were so sheer that they barely provided any proper modesty, and so she was able to see most of her body beyond only her face. There was neither spot nor blemish anywhere upon her body, save for the gentle lines of aging that had slowly begun to creep upon her ever since her first jubilee. In the reflection of the mirror, she saw the figure of the Eternal's angel step out from the shadows. She turned back to him, a worried look in her eyes. "You smote him, didn't you?" she asked. He nodded grimly. "Are you going to kill him?" "Not unless he returns you to your lord husband," was Gabriel's reply. That, however, was easier said than done. Pharaoh went to the physicians and was examined. They confirmed that it was leprosy and implored him to seek the aid of the gods of Mizraim. So he sent about his priests to do this for him, while he saw to the Habiru. Thus Sarai learned from Hadjetre, who waited upon her and told her what little she knew of the Pharaoh's doings. Abram was invited to the city of Ankh Tawy to stand before the Pharaoh and receive his blessing. Abram went with Eleazar in tow, while the caravan had pitched their tents on the eastern side of the great river. In the throne room they were brought forth, Abram and Eleazar, and were instructed to ascend to the 1st and 30th step. These were honored guests, and not nobodies. But in their conversation, the Pharaoh was hidden behind a curtain, and they could not see him. But they heard his voice. "Are you the Habiru chieftain, whose sister I have taken to wife?" the Pharaoh asked. There was a moment of silence, as if the Eternal gave Abram the opportunity to speak truthfully and avail himself of any further disaster. But, like Adam and Eve, he did not take that opportunity. "Yes, my lord. I am Abram, son of Terah. The prince Setaneshret tells me that you came into this land to sojourn," the Pharaoh stated. "That is true, my lord. Wherefore do you wish to sojourn in the Black Land?" "There was a famine in the land of Canaan," said Abram. "Our flocks and herds were starving, and so were my people. So we came here to find green pastures and water for ourselves." "Indeed," the Pharaoh marveled. "How is it that the prince of filthy shepherds has with him the fairest jewel in all the land?" "I know not, my lord," Abram said, blushing. "Perhaps it is the gift of the eternal God on my behalf." "And who is this eternal God of yours?" Pharaoh asked. "He is the ruler and creator of the heavens and the earth," Abram replied. "The sustainer of all life, the friend of the righteous, and protector of the innocent." "So many fine titles," the Pharaoh asked. But what is his name? What is his father's name? Does he have children? What is his son's name, if you can tell?" Abram seemed surprised at these words. "The Eternal is eternal. He has always been. He has no father, no one else beside him." "Absurd," Pharaoh dismissed. "The gods have children. Everyone knows that. Our gods have many children. Are you saying that your God is alone, with no one else with him?" "That is so, my lord," Abram replied. "And that he alone made the world and sustains all life within it?" "Yes, my lord." The Pharaoh exclaimed, "He must truly be great to do all that by himself. And surely he has blessed you, his servant. Though you are a shepherd, the Prince Hadjetre tells me that you have many flocks of sheep, cattle, and luxurious goods, even the white." "His words are true, my lord," Abram replied. "Astounding!" the Pharaoh exclaimed. "Come now, Habiru. Since you have been blessed by your God with so many good things, we shall bless you as well. You and your people shall be allowed to sojourn in the Black Land. I have given the nome of the plumed falcon as your sister's inheritance. It is the best of all my lands. For you I shall also give 100 gold debens, 30 logs of ebony, 100 rolls of linen, 60 male servants, 20 female servants, 30 cattle, and an even greater honor than these." "My lord," Abram exclaimed, "what greater honor could you bestow upon me?" "You shall sit at court here at Ankh Tawy," he replied. "A seat shall be always available for you, on the right hand of the throne." Abram bowed in respect to the Pharaoh, and then was dismissed. He seemed quite bewildered that the Pharaoh had given so much to him in such a short amount of time. From the rumors that he had heard of the people of Mizraim, he expected far worse from them. After a convenient time had passed, the Pharaoh summoned Sarai to his bedchamber. But the same incident took place. Rather than rage in anger at Sarai, this time the Pharaoh seemed more frustrated with the gods than with her. Yet again, Abram was summoned before the palace and heaped with more honors. Setaneshret had lauded to the Pharaoh the orderly arrangement of the camp of the Habiru, and their accurate account of numbers. The Pharaoh was impressed by Abram's knowledge, and so ordered that the wise men of the land have him sit among them and teach them of the wisdom that he knew. "You have deceived me, Abram," the Pharaoh said. "You appear to be nothing more than an ignorant shepherd, yet you know the wisdom of the gods and the ways of the heavens. My people could learn much from you." So the days became weeks, and the weeks became months. During that time, a terrible epidemic swept across the city of Ankh Tawy. The whole house of Pharaoh was afflicted with what the physicians could only describe as leprosy. At first, only the Pharaoh was afflicted, and he kept to himself and suffered the various and sundry treatments prescribed to him by his physicians, but to no avail. But then this plague began to spread among the rest of his household. The wise men could no longer show themselves at the Pharaoh's throne room to learn of the ways of the heavens from Abram, for they themselves were afflicted. Hadjetre wore a veil upon her face to conceal the marks of it in the corners of her mouth. At last, one evening, Sarai was summoned to the bedchamber of the Pharaoh. She sat there, aloof and distant, a sorrowful look on her face. Though no one had touched her, the suffering of the people around her had finally broken her resolve. She could not bear to see Hadjetre suffer so, when she had been nothing but kind to her. Even the other people around them, they did not deserve this plague, brought on by their deception. She felt in her heart that if she kept up the deception any longer, the whole of the Black Land would become depopulated through plague. The Pharaoh entered, his face and arms wrapped in bandages, which emitted pungent odors. From between the bandages, his eyes were filled with sorrow and frustration as he approached Sarai. He did not come too close, nor stretch out his hand to touch her, for the plague was still heavy upon him. "My lord," she greeted. "What have I done?" the Pharaoh asked. "For 3 months the Black Land has been afflicted by this plague. They say that the walls of the palace are infected by it. I sought answers from the gods, and they told me to honor your brother from whose hand you were taken. and honor him I did. Yet this accursed plague continues to afflict us. No such plague have we known in this land in all of our days." He gasped in horror, looking down at his bandaged hands. Then he looked back up at Sarai. "This plague started as soon as you were brought into my house," he accused. "My lord," she replied, "there is no plague upon me. Your daughter was very thorough in purifying me." "Then it is because of you that this plague afflicts us," the Pharaoh cried out. He took a step closer to her and fell to his knees in front of her. "Wherefore has this plague come upon us? What have we done to you to deserve this pestilence?" "Do you ask in earnest, my lord?" Sarai asked. "Yes, of course I do," the Pharaoh cried out. "My whole house suffers on account of you. Tell me what we have done." At this he threw up his hands. "Pardon my harsh words, my lady. I do not mean to offend you and bring more suffering upon us. I speak only of the agony of this pestilence, for myself and for my people." Sarai swallowed hard, then slowly made her answer. "Surely, my lord, this plague has come upon you because you have taken me from the hand of my husband and made me as your wife, when I am the wife of another man." The Pharaoh's eyes widened in shock. "Who then is the man whom you were taken from?" "Abram is my lord husband," she replied. "He said you were his sister," the Pharaoh replied. "You said he was your brother." "We are indeed kin," Sarai clarified, "but he instructed me to tell no one that I was his wife, lest he should be put to death on account of me." The Pharaoh sighed, burying his face, bandages and all, in his bandaged hands. All he could do was moan pitifully from the intense pain that he was under. Sarai felt sorry for the monarch, and, if she could have done so, would have touched his head in comfort. But he was afflicted with leprosy, and she was in a very compromising situation. Instead, she merely kept her peace and lowered her eyes, sorry of the part she had played in this great misfortune. At last, the Pharaoh rose up and composed himself. "You shall be returned to your husband," he said, a grim, stoic resolve in his voice. "You may keep all that I have given you, as a peace offering on account of this great pestilence." With that, he told her to return to her own bedchambers and await his orders. The very next morning, Abram was brought before the throne room of the Pharaoh, with Eleazar in tow behind him. There was a tenseness in the air. Perhaps, Abram thought, it was because of the sickness that had befallen the palace. Everyone had their faces covered in some way or another, save for him and Eleazar. Not unnoticed was the fact that Abram's usual seat was missing from its place. He was about to ask why he had been brought forth, when the Pharaoh rose up from his throne. "Come near, Abram of the Habiru," he said. Abram nodded, and immediately began the long trek up the stairs to the 1st and 30th step of the throne. After all, he was considered a great one of the court, and had a place for himself, though he knew not where it was, and had by now memorized in some way the protocol of the court. But as soon as he raised his foot to set it upon the 4th stair, the Pharaoh's voice boomed out in anger. "Come no further!" "My lord," Abram said to the Pharaoh, "I am indeed a stranger in this land, but has it not been custom for me to ascend to the 1st and 30th step?" "So it was, when you were a friend of the Pharaoh," said the Pharaoh. "But what friend would deceive his brother in such a manner as you have?" "My lord, wherefore have you deceived me in this great manner?" the Pharaoh asked, with anger in his voice. "Was it not you who told the Prince Seternesret that the woman who was your sister, and were silent on the matter that she was in fact your wife as well?" "My lord, it is true as you have said," Abram replied. I only did this because I heard that the people of Mizraim were sensual and would have slain me and taken her if I said that she is my wife." "And which lying tongue told you these things?" the Pharaoh retorted. "May that tongue wither and be cursed for all time. On account of your heeding these lying words and deceiving us in turn, you have soiled what would have been a worthy alliance. I sought to elevate you to a place of honor as my brother, and instead, one of us might have lain with a married woman, and so been devoured by Amet upon death, and never seen the field of reeds. With that, he gave a loud command in his tongue. Abram and Eleazar gave a start when they saw 2 guards approach from the side of the throne room. Between them walked Sarai, dressed in the clothes of the women of Mizraim. Your time of sojourn in the Black Land is at an end, the Pharaoh said to Abram. Behold now your wife, untouched as she was when we received her. Take her, and go your way. For a moment, Abram stood aghast as he looked at Sarai. The clothes she wore were so sheer that they would be considered indecent in the desert lands where they would be returning. Sarai also was filled with awe. She had feared that she would never see Abram again, for it was not out of her mind that the Pharaoh might change his mind in his wrath and have Abram put to death for deceiving him. Now all their fears were put to rest. Sarai picked up the sides of her skirt and skipped into Abram's arms. As she approached, Abram held out his arms and wrapped her up in a warm, loving embrace. He kissed the top of her head, and she wept into his chest. Praise the Eternal that you are safe, Abram said, his eyes leaking. Praise the Eternal, I have found you again, Sarai wept. The story continues in chapter 13.